They found the room in 1923, behind a bricked-up wall, 12 feet below the original foundation. No records, no blueprints, no reason it should exist. Inside, there were 19 iron restraints, still bolted to the floor, a scorched Bible, and a journal soaked in something that turned black and brittle with time. The writing? Ashford ink. Her name signed in trembling script on every page. Temperance Ashford, 1805. The last entry simply read, "I saw God, and he blinked first." That room was never mentioned in the official reports. The university that uncovered it sealed the documents within days. The historian who first cataloged the contents vanished 6 months later in a supposed boating accident. But if you know where to look, really look, you'll find her notes, fragmented, scattered, buried under pseudonyms in obscure medical archives and old ecclesiastical files. They point to one family, one legacy. Ashford. That name has been scrubbed from most American historical records, not because it was forgotten, but because someone needed you never to find it. Not in sermons, not in textbooks, not even in whispers. But I found it, and once you see what they did, who they really were, you won't be able to unsee it either. This isn't just about a convent in the woods. It's about a bloodline that understood, long before Freud, Jung, or Pavlov, how to bend the human mind until it snapped into obedience. They weren't witches. They weren't saints. They were something far more dangerous. Pioneers of psychological warfare wearing the mask of Christian mercy. Over the next hour, I'm going to show you how they did it, what they built, why it still matters, and why the darkness they mastered didn't die with them. You're not watching a story. You're entering a vault. And what's locked inside will change you forever. The Ashfords did not disappear. They evolved. They changed their names, changed their institutions. What began as a convent in the wilds of Maine became something far more refined, more accepted, and infinitely more dangerous. You know their descendants. You've seen their work, but you never recognized the fingerprints. Until now. There is a reason the Ashfords vanished from the record after 1823. No gravestones, no death certificates, no probate filings, because they weren't buried. They were absorbed into medicine, into psychiatry, into the ivory towers of Ivy League universities and elite boarding schools, where they quietly repackaged their experiments as behavioral science and moral hygiene. You ever wonder why early psychiatric facilities looked more like prisons than hospitals? Why women who read too much, argued too fiercely, or simply refused to smile on command were diagnosed with hysteria and institutionalized? That was no accident. That was the legacy of the Ashfords. Their theories spread like a virus, passed between surgeons, theologians, and military planners under the guise of progress. And every method traced back to that fortress in the woods, where silence was louder than screams. You see, the Ashford women were not mystics. They were system builders, engineers of the soul. They didn't seek your salvation. They sought your obedience. They studied how pain could erase defiance, how isolation could fracture identity, how the right ritual, repeated enough times, could make any woman forget who she was and become exactly what they needed. This was not about God. It was about control. And it didn't stop in 1805. When Mother Agatha disappeared from the records, she reappeared 2 years later in Massachusetts under a different name, delivering lectures to all male medical academies on the moral correction of the feminine will. When Sister Prudence vanished, her surgical notes surfaced in early lobotomy manuals decades before the procedure was officially recognized. And Temperance? Some say she died in that chamber. But the truth is darker. There's a lineage, a continuation, from convent to clinic to boardroom. This isn't about the past, it's about the program. And it's still running. Reformation. That's what they called it. Not treatment, not therapy. Reformation, as in to destroy the original and remake it in someone else's image. A soul stripped to bone, a mind rebuilt like a cathedral. They told the families it was a sanctuary, but it was never a sanctuary. It was a furnace, and the women who entered it were the fuel. The Ashfords believed no woman was born corrupted, only malformed, improperly shaped by weak mothers, absent fathers, or the poisons of education and autonomy. They didn't see hysteria, they saw potential, and they developed methods, not just to suppress defiance, but to reprogram desire. You need to understand, this wasn't random cruelty. It was curriculum. Each woman who entered the Convent of Eternal Tears was assessed, classified, and assigned a treatment pathway based on what the Ashfords called the triad of disorder. 3 categories of female deviance: intellectual rebellion, emotional volatility, and spiritual contamination. The methods were tailored, precisely. Women who questioned scripture were subjected to visual deprivation and biblical repetition until their speech patterns broke down. Those who resisted domestic obedience were isolated and forced to reenact household rituals for hours under threat of neurological adjustment. But the worst were the women who didn't break. For them, Sister Prudence had a different approach. Neurocorrective intervention, a term you won't find in any 19th century medical text, but it's buried deep in the Ashford journals. Procedures involving cranial penetration, electrical stimulation, and pharmacological sedation, all designed to remove memory, erode identity, and replace resistance with devotion. Temperance called it cleansing. Agatha called it alignment with divine order. But what it really was psychological annihilation. And the terrifying part? It worked. The families reported miraculous results. Disobedient daughters returning home meek, prayerful, and utterly obedient. Troubled wives transformed into soft-spoken models of virtue. But look closer, and the truth begins to leak through. No eye contact, no spontaneous speech, no memory of life before the convent. These weren't healed women. They were rewritten scripts, obedient shells. And if this sounds familiar, it should. Because the techniques the Ashfords developed didn't die with them. They went underground. Then they went professional. By the time the world forgot the Ashfords, the world had already become them. Their systems, their cold precision, had spread like a virus, sanitized, hidden beneath white coats and Latin terminology. But make no mistake, the same altar remained. Only now the worship was clinical, and the gods were federal. In the decades after the convent closed, the Ashford legacy mutated, embedding itself in the institutions America trusted most: psychiatry, education, public morality. The same tools once used on defiant girls in the Maine wilderness were now being wielded on a national scale, wrapped in the language of health, safety, patriotism. Let me be clear, this wasn't a fluke. It was blueprint execution. Take the rise of state hospitals in the early 20th century. Over 300 institutions across the U.S. sprang up like mushrooms after rain. But their architecture echoed the convent: high windows, echoing corridors, reinforced doors, subterranean treatment rooms. Look at the documents, and you'll see phrases lifted directly from Ashford records: discipline through obedience, cognitive realignment, transgressive memory suppression. Coincidence? No, this was replication. What began as religious penance became federal policy. By the 1940s, women were still being institutionalized for reading too much, refusing marriage, or, God forbid, enjoying sex. The diagnosis was no longer possession. It was borderline, neurotic, unstable. The prayers were gone, replaced by electroconvulsive therapy, chlorpromazine, and surgical optimism. They told us it was progress. But when you peel back the veneer, you find the same rituals, the same goals. Erase the woman, keep the body, make her smile. That smile, polished, practiced, plastered across decades of American advertisements and homemaker manuals. It wasn't real. It was manufactured compliance. A psychological prosthetic stitched onto the face of survival. And who taught them how? The Ashfords did. We just changed the robes for lab coats, the chalice for a clipboard. And here's the part they don't want you to ask. If they mastered this in 1803, what are they doing with it now? What have these systems evolved into? Because this machine didn't stop with women. It didn't stop at all. It scaled. It adapted. And now, it's being used on everyone. Control isn't loud. It's not a dictator screaming in your face. True control is silent. It doesn't ask for permission. It designs your decisions before you ever think you made them. That was the real genius of the Ashfords. They didn't just build tools to punish disobedience. They built environments that made rebellion impossible. Understand this. Every wall of the convent was a lesson. Every hallway, a test. The women weren't just imprisoned, they were conditioned. Agatha Ashford studied more than scripture. She studied architecture, acoustics, color theory, the use of light and shadow to create subconscious compliance. Her journals describe how to weaken resolve by exposure to prolonged monochromatic surroundings, how to disrupt natural circadian rhythms to increase suggestibility. She wasn't just reprogramming thoughts. She was hacking the entire nervous system. Sister Prudence took it further. Her fascination with early neurology wasn't just surgical, it was strategic. Her notes detail how the brain reacts to ritual, repetition, rhythm, deprivation, reward. These women reverse-engineered the soul, reducing faith, identity, memory itself, into components, variables, switches to flip, systems to subdue. And temperance. Temperance studied the aftermath. What happens after the break? How to rebuild a new persona in the vacuum left behind. She called it persona transfer theory, stripping someone down to the scaffolding of their psyche, and then grafting new language, new fears, new loyalties onto it. She pioneered what we now call trauma bonding. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It's everywhere. From military hazing rituals, to corporate training retreats, to viral influencer mindset coaching. This isn't ancient history, it's modern design. Obedience has been industrialized. You live inside it, every day. That perfectly timed notification, that subtle guilt woven into advertising, that algorithm that keeps showing you what they want you to become. It's not by accident. It's architecture. And it started in a cold stone convent in Maine with 3 women who discovered something the world wasn't ready for. You don't need chains to enslave a mind, just precision and patience. They didn't see pain as a consequence. They saw it as a curriculum. To the Ashfords, suffering wasn't tragic. It was essential. It was the scalpel that cut away the self, carving compliance from chaos. They believed that pain, administered with precision and consistency, could force the soul to surrender its resistance. Not once, not briefly, but permanently. They called it doctrine of useful suffering, and it became the backbone of everything they built. Agatha's writings describe it in chilling detail, how physical agony, when paired with isolation and divine language, could be used to recode belief. Pain wasn't just punishment. It was purification. It broke identity into shards and let the operator choose which pieces to leave behind. But they didn't stop with flesh. That was just the entry point. Emotional pain was more efficient. Guilt, shame, abandonment, the silence of being forgotten by your family, the weight of praying for forgiveness while no one answered. The Ashfords understood that nothing turns a woman into an empty vessel faster than invisible pain, and they refined it like science. They tracked the days it took for defiance to crack. They timed how long it took before women began to blame themselves for the abuse. They recorded how many screams it took before a name was forgotten and replaced with a number. This was not cruelty for pleasure. This was weaponized suffering, precise, scheduled, optimized. Pain was the fire. Obedience was the product. Now listen carefully, because this is where the past starts looking uncomfortably familiar. Modern systems still use this formula, not with whips and cellars, but with policies and screens. The burnout cycle at work, the isolation of digital life, the shame-fed obedience demanded by public opinion, social metrics, and moral correctness. You think you're free, but every structure you interact with, from your education to your profession to your social circles, is quietly teaching you the same lesson. Suffering makes you obedient. It teaches you to comply, to self-police, to avoid risk, to stop asking why. Because somewhere, deep inside your nervous system, you've been taught that pain isn't to be escaped, it's to be earned. And once you believe that, you don't need a jailer. You become your own. Not every woman screamed. Some went silent. Not out of fear, not from sedation, but because the mind had been taught to disappear. The Ashfords called it the silence protocol. It wasn't just about obedience. It was about deletion, erasure of the self through controlled dissociation. A spiritual lobotomy administered without a single scalpel. And the most disturbing part? It worked faster than any surgery. First, they would isolate the subject. No voice, no reflection, no name spoken aloud. Mirrors were forbidden, journals confiscated. The woman's past was denied, dismissed, or reinterpreted through the convent's doctrine. The language changed. You were never married. You never read that book. You were never free. Every time she contradicted it, punishment followed. Mild at first, then more precise. Then came the second stage, submission through fragmentation. Every part of the woman's personality, her humor, her anger, her curiosity, was reframed as a defect, a demon to be purged. She was rewarded only when she adopted the traits the sisters deemed holy: silence, stillness, submission. Slowly, her inner dialogue began to shift. The voice in her head that once said, "I am," now whispered, "I must." By the end of the third week, most women didn't ask to leave. They thanked their captors. They smiled. They prayed for more. And by the sixth week, they were often granted what the Ashfords called status realignment, a final rite in which the subject's old name was ritually destroyed, and she was assigned a new one, clean, simple, forgettable, usually after a ceremony that looked suspiciously like a funeral. It was psychological execution, and it's still happening. You see it in high control groups, you see it in cults, you see it in prisons and elite boot camps. You even see it in digital culture, where you're trained to erase your own instincts and replace them with pre-approved personalities, where you're punished for nuance and rewarded for mimicry. The silence protocol is alive. It's in schools that train you to regurgitate, not question. In apps that punish you for not performing enough. In jobs that praise you for smiling through exhaustion. Silence isn't peace. It's proof. Proof that they've reached the final stage, where you don't need to be watched, because you've forgotten who you ever were without them. Beneath the chapel floor was another chapel. No windows, no pews, no light except for oil lamps set into carved skulls, real ones. It wasn't meant for worship. It was meant for ritual alignment. You see, the Ashfords weren't just building a spiritual correction center. They were designing an altar, not to a god above, but to a system below. Something older than Christianity, older than written history, something that demanded order above all. And if you believe this was just some Gothic relic of religious delusion, you're not listening closely enough. What happened in that underground chapel wasn't just symbolic. It was operational. Subjects were brought down blindfolded, No clocks, no markers. They didn't know if it was night or day. They were made to kneel for hours on end in a precise arrangement, always in threes. One to speak, one to listen, one to confess. Over and over, the same cycle, the same mantras, the same voice whispering through hidden grates, telling them who they were, what they had done, and what they must become. This was ritualized sensory manipulation, the blueprint for modern interrogation. But it wasn't random cruelty. It followed exact geometric patterns carved into the stone itself, ancient markings that predated the convent. Some say the land was cursed. Others say the Ashfords chose it for that very reason, because they believed the earth there was thin, that what they built would resonate beneath the surface, echo into something deeper. And maybe they were right. Because after those rituals, women changed, not just in behavior, but in perception. Some emerged convinced they had seen angels. Others claimed to have died and returned with no memory of who they were. A few began speaking in languages they had never been taught. Agatha's journals called these successful integrations. Prudence called them neuroliminal awakes, nings. But Temperance? Temperance called them hollows, empty vessels, capable of perfect obedience, zero resistance, total submission. And today, you see that chapel everywhere. Not made of stone, but built into systems, platforms, feedback loops, echo chambers, where you're fed a cycle of input, response, confession, where you're taught to speak what they reward, repeat what they validate, and surrender your doubts in exchange for digital absolution. The old rituals never died. They were digitized. Now you kneel, and the voice you hear in the dark isn't yours anymore. Control doesn't begin with violence. It begins with vocabulary. The Ashfords knew this. That's why their first reform wasn't physical. It was linguistic. They rewrote the language of their subjects, word by word. Terms like punishment became correction. Isolation became reflection. Pain was rebranded as divine clarity. In time, women began to thank their captors for the very tools that destroyed them. That is the power of manipulated language. You see, once you control what someone can say, you begin to control what they can think. Words are the scaffolding of thought. Remove one, you remove the idea it holds. Twist one, you twist the very logic of reality. And when you do that long enough, they'll police their own mind for you. Every morning, the women at Eternal Tears were required to recite the Litany of Surrender, a 42-line prayer crafted by Agatha herself. It wasn't just devotion, it was code, a programming sequence repeated until belief collapsed into obedience. One line read, "I reject the voice that questions, for questioning is the seed of disobedience." Another, "What I desire is flawed, what I am given is holy." It didn't take long before those prayers became internalized, permanent, undeniable. Even in their sleep, the women whispered them. Now look around. Have we really evolved, or has this same tactic gone global? Today we chant new litanies. Trust the experts. Stay in your lane. Be kind, no matter the cost. Phrases that sound virtuous, but function like traps, designed not to uplift, but to shut down resistance before it can form. And when someone dares to question, they're called dangerous, unstable, problematic, just like the women in 1803. But here's the truth. They don't want you to see. The language of obedience always starts as virtue. It dresses itself as kindness, as order, as care. But underneath, it's a muzzle, a leash, a script you didn't write, and don't realize you've been forced to speak. So ask yourself, brother, when was the last time you used your words? Not the ones they gave you. Yours. Because if you can't remember, they've already won. The Ashfords weren't satisfied with submission. They wanted conversion. Not religious, but existential. They believed obedience was only the first phase. The real goal was transformation, a total rewiring of belief, perception, instinct. And they had a name for this process. Phase 3. Reconstitution of reality. Once a subject's will was shattered, through pain, silence, language distortion, they didn't leave her hollow. No, they filled her with a new world, one of their own design. Agatha wrote, "A woman untethered from self is a vessel for divine order, but it is we who define the divine." Understand what she's saying. Once someone is broken, they'll believe anything, if it gives them structure, hope, identity. That's where Temperance came in. The youngest sister, the quietest, but the most dangerous. She was the rebuilder. She would take these erased minds and feed them a new framework, stories, rules, visions of a better life, if only they stayed obedient. She made them believe that the suffering was not punishment, but proof they had been chosen. That's when the most terrifying transformation occurred. They didn't want to escape. They wanted to recruit others. Yes, the same women who had been tortured began writing letters to their families, not begging for rescue, but urging their sisters, daughters, mothers to come find peace. Some even returned home to act as living proof, calm, submissive, spiritually radiant, and hollow. They became missionaries of their own indoctrination. And that, right there, that's the final phase of all psychological control. When the prisoner becomes the warden, when the broken becomes the evangelist. You see it today, everywhere, in political extremes, in corporate culture, in algorithmic echo chambers, in men who parrot scripts about masculinity they don't understand, in women who punish themselves for driyas, Ming beyond their role. The Ashfords didn't just run a convent, they built a prototype for systems that could break a mind, then make it beg to serve. Ask yourself, how much of what you believe was chosen by you, and how much was installed after you were weakened? Once you know the answer to that, brother, you never go back. They kept no public records, no graves, no obituaries. But in the winter of 1804, one name vanished from the registry of the Millbridge parish, without warning, explanation, or memorial. Her name was Eliza Mallory, 17, born to a preacher. She was known for two things: her voice, a pure soprano that moved grown men to tears in Sunday service, and her defiance. She read Greek, quoted Voltaire, argued against arranged marriage. She was bright, brilliant, untouchable, until the Ashfords invited her for temporary reflection. 3 weeks, they said, just a retreat, a place to recalibrate the soul. She was never seen again. Her father, Reverend Malcolm Mallory, demanded answers. He stormed the convent gates with his Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. He threatened excommunication, accused the sisters of abduction, but when the town constable arrived to intervene, the Ashfords presented a document, signed, sealed, legal, a transfer of guardianship, Eliza's own signature at the bottom. The date? 1 day after her arrival. It didn't make sense. She hadn't brought ink, she hadn't brought legal papers. She wouldn't have signed it. But there it was, neat, precise, perfect, witnessed by Mother Agatha and Sister Prudence. Reverend Mallory returned home silent. He resigned from the church 2 weeks later and was found wandering the coastline 6 months after that, muttering to himself, refusing to enter any building made of stone. The disappearance was never investigated. Why? Because the Ashfords had already rewritten the story. The town began to say Eliza had chosen the convent, that her wildness had been tamed, that she was happier now, closer to God. But no one had seen her. Not once. What happened to her? That was the moment the community knew, deep in their bones, something was wrong. But fear is louder than justice. And the Ashfords were generous. They gave to the poor, funded the church, healed the sick. And when your entire world depends on a lie, you protect the lie, even when it costs you your daughter, even when it costs you yourself. That was the first disappearance. But it wasn't the last. It was only the beginning of what the Ashfords called the Great Quieting. A quiet that still echoes. Right now, inside institutions, inside families, inside you. It began with one girl, then 3, then 7. By 1811, over 43 women had entered the Convent of Eternal Tears and vanished from public record. No death certificates, no returned letters, no sightings, just erasure. But no one asked questions, because the Ashfords were careful, strategic. They didn't take women with strong political ties or wealthy families. They chose the unwanted, the scandalous, the inconvenient, daughters who shamed their fathers, wives who spoke too freely, sisters who read too much. Each disappearance came with a narrative, crafted, precise, believable. She eloped. She returned to England. She had a nervous collapse and joined the Silent Order. Or simply, she chose to stay. The town accepted it, because to admit the truth would have shattered the illusion that they were civilized, that they were better than the old world, that their faith and its institutions were pure. So they stayed silent. That was the Great Quieting. And it was engineered. Agatha's writings make it clear. A community in denial is easier to control than an individual in protest. They knew if the townspeople could be made to lie to themselves, their compliance was guaranteed. They even had metrics. Prudence kept meticulous journals noting the emotional resilience threshold of each family, how long it took before they stopped asking questions, what incentives made them complicit, coin, favor, social approval. Once someone chose comfort over truth, they were left alone. But if they pushed, if they knocked on the convent's doors too loudly, they were quieted too, sometimes by scandal, sometimes by accidents, always with plausible deniability. Now pause, because this isn't just a dark chapter in a forgotten town. This is the model. Look at your world today. People vanish from the public eye, reputations destroyed overnight, accounts deleted, voices drowned in noise, not by force, but by narrative. And we call it justice. We call it safety. We nod along because someone else wrote the story for us. We don't ask, where did she go? We say, she must have deserved it. That's the Great Quieting. Not just the absence of noise, but the replacement of truth with a comfortable lie. And the worst part, we do it to each other now. They didn't ask for apologies. They extracted them, twisted, public, ritualized. Confession wasn't about forgiveness at the Convent of Eternal Tears. It was about control. Every woman brought in for treatment was required to participate in a sacred rite known only as the cleansing hour. But it wasn't prayer. It wasn't reflection. It was interrogation, masked as redemption. 3 sisters would stand in a triangle around the subject, Agatha at the head, Prudence to the left, Temperance to the right, and they would begin the litany. Not of sins committed, but of sins assigned. You lusted. You disobeyed your father. You tempted a man with your voice. You read texts forbidden to your station. You believed your thoughts mattered. And here's the trick. They didn't care if it was true. The goal was to make her say it was. Because once you confess to a lie long enough, your nervous system can't tell the difference. You own it. You live it. You reshape your identity around it. And now they have you. Not just body, not just behavior, but self-concept. That's the deepest collar, one you fasten around your own throat. Confession became the currency of survival. The faster you broke, the more they praised you. The slower you crumbled, the more they starved you of touch, warmth, light. And the ones who refused were stripped, bound, and left in the chapel below for a night of pure reconditioning. Most never resisted again. But here's the most damning part. They recorded everything. The Ashfords kept volumes, black leather tomes filled with names, dates, quotes, women's most private thoughts, their regrets, their false confessions, even fabricated sexual fantasies designed to shame them into submission. Why? Because confession, once recorded, becomes a lever. It becomes leverage. Insurance, blackmail, proof. Sound familiar? In today's world, we're trained to confess constantly. We post our flaws, we broadcast our regrets, we expose our sins for digital praise, algorithmic forgiveness. But here's the question you're not supposed to ask. Who's collecting your confessions? Who's keeping your file? Who benefits from your shame? Because the Ashfords may be gone, but their system is still running. And now, it's automated. There was one room no carpenter ever entered, one room no townsman ever saw, one room even Agatha was said to avoid during the hours before dawn. They called it Temperance's Chamber. It wasn't on any blueprint. It wasn't part of the original design, but every woman who emerged, changed, had passed through it, and none of them would speak of what they saw inside. But some wrote, fragments hidden in margins of prayer books, scratched beneath bed frames, smuggled in torn cloth. The same image appeared over and over, a circle of mirrors, a seat of iron, and a girl in black. Temperance, the youngest Ashford, the quietest, but the most feared. She didn't shout. She didn't hit. She whispered. She whispered until your mind broke in half. She believed in one thing only: disintegration before reintegration. Where prudence used tools, temperance used reflection. She would sit a woman in that chair, alone, surrounded by mirrors, and begin asking questions. Not cruel, not loud, just precise. Why did he leave you? What part of you was unlovable? When did you first learn your body was wrong? Who told you to think you were more than this? And then silence. Long, unbearable silence. The woman would stare at her own face for hours. In the beginning, she'd weep, then rage, then beg. But eventually, something cracked. Not always with screaming, sometimes just a breath, a sigh, a twitch. That's when Temperance would speak again. And this time, she inserted new truths, new names, new sins. It wasn't torture. It was programming. And it worked. Temperance's chamber wasn't built with stone. It was built with intention. A laboratory for identity collapse. A mirror that didn't show you your face, but the version of you they needed. Today, we live in a digital temperance chamber. Constant mirrors, relentless comparison. Every scroll, every feed, I filter. A reflection asking, why aren't you enough? And once you crack, they don't have to punish you. You'll do it yourself. Temperance never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She just showed you, until the reflection blinked first. In the Ashford archives, there is 1 year completely erased. No entries, no letters, no shipments, no patient logs. Just a blank space between March 1812 and April 1813. A full 13 months, vanishing like a severed artery in an otherwise obsessive record-keeping system. Historians call it an oversight. But those who've read between the lines know better. Because something happened in that year. Something so devastating, so uncontainable, The sisters had no choice but to bury it. But the silence couldn't hide everything, not from those who remembered what came before and what came after. Before the silence, the women who emerged from the convent were subdued, yes, but intact. They walked, spoke, prayed. Some even returned home, changed, but functional. After the silence, the women stopped coming out altogether. Or worse, they came out wrong. One stumbled into Millbridge at dawn, barefoot, bloodless, half-naked, reciting Latin phrases that hadn't been spoken in 1,000 years. Another was found floating in a bog, her skin covered in strange symmetrical carvings, not self-inflicted, not made by blade or fire, but etched with surgical precision. She bore no expression of fear. Just peace. Too much peace. One more, an 11-year-old girl who had vanished the previous year, was seen briefly in the woods by hunters. She smiled at them. Her mouth didn't move. She smiled with her eyes. And then she vanished again into the pines. Whatever happened in that missing year, it was no longer psychological. It was ontological. The Ashfords had gone beyond obedience, beyond reprogramming, into something fundamentally other. A threshold had been crossed. And here's the most terrifying part. They didn't record it because they didn't want to remember it. Even Agatha, whose journals cataloged everything from menstrual cycles to torture calibrations, made no mention of the year. Just one phrase, inked in trembling hand in the margin of her final intact volume. We opened it too wide. What is it? A veil? A pattern? A force? The truth is, it doesn't matter. Because they couldn't close it again. And neither can we. You feel it, don't you? Something underneath the fabric of your world. Pushing, humming, waiting. The Ashfords always spoke of descent, not metaphorically, not as some poetic religious trial. They meant it literally. Beneath the convent lay a secondary foundation, deeper than the basement, older than the stone, carved directly into the bedrock. It was not built by the Ashfords, not in 1798, not by anyone from Millbridge. No, this was something else, something pre-colonial, pre-Christian, pre-human, and in the missing year they opened it. According to a recovered fragment, likely Prudence's hand, they had discovered a sealed vault beneath the sub-basement. No hinges, no handles, just a perfect circle carved into the floor, ringed by 7 ancient sigils that pulsed faintly when touched. They weren't random symbols. They were patterns of reversal, inverted geometry, anti-logic, designs that seemed to mock the mind, trying to comprehend them. Temperance, of all people, was the first to kneel. She placed her hand against the center glyph and said just one word, scribbled in Latin, Recipio, I receive. The floor split. No sound, no tremor, just sudden, impossible absence. Beneath the vault, a narrow spiral staircase descending into what they described as unlit architecture, meaning not that there was no light, but that light itself seemed to fail there. They went down for 7 nights, one sister at a time. Only 3 returned. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. Temperance stopped eating. Prudence began carving the sigils into her own arms, not out of madness, but precision. She said they taught her things. That prayer had always been upside down, and the true shape of God was not what we imagined, but what we feared. And Agatha? She wrote the most disturbing line in the entire Ashford canon. We thought we were digging into the earth to correct women's minds, but the earth dug back. From that moment forward, the convent was no longer about healing. It became a mouth, feeding, swallowing, transforming. The rituals changed. The sounds from below stopped being human, and the women who entered the chamber after that didn't always remain women. or even remain. They found something beneath, yes. But it wasn't a discovery. It was a summoning. Millbridge was never a large town, but it was strong. Fishermen, carpenters, God-fearing families with hard hands and harder beliefs. They survived bitter winters, shipwrecks, and forest raids. But what came after the Ashfords opened the chamber wasn't a storm. It was a slow collapse. A rot that wore the face of peace. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The convent stopped accepting new women for 3 months. The sisters said they were undergoing spiritual renewal. Townsfolk nodded, gossiped, moved on. But then the atmosphere changed. Millbridge grew quiet. Too quiet. Laughter disappeared from the tavern. Church hymns sounded hollow. Men who once spoke boldly now whispered at the market, eyes darting like prey. Children stopped playing near the woods. Birdsong ceased. And then the dreams started. Farmers, dock workers, housewives, dozens of people across age, class, and denomination reported waking from the same dream. A staircase, descending, each step narrower, each breath harder to take. And at the bottom, a door made of bone. But they couldn't wake up before they touched it. One man clawed his eyes out to stop seeing the glyphs. Another threw himself into the sea, leaving behind a journal filled with drawings, crude, frantic symbols matching those carved into the stone beneath the convent. Even animals began acting strangely. Dogs refused to approach the convent grounds. Horses went mad within 50 yards of the structure. Cows birthed stillborn calves with black sclera and human teeth. And all the while, the Ashfords were thriving. Their skin glowed, their movements became slower, smoother. Not graceful, but precise, like marionettes with strings no one could see. They smiled more. Too much. Even the most devout began to fear them. But fear gave way to paralysis. No one challenged them. No one stormed the gates. No one dared repeat what the dreams whispered. They are no longer 3. The mouth has 4 now. Something else had entered the convent. Something that used the sisters the way they had used others. Millbridge wasn't conquered by an army. It didn't fall to famine or war. It was bled dry from beneath. By the same force that now infects boardrooms, university halls, social feeds, the invisible rot that silences your instincts until you forget you ever had them. It was June 1815. No announcement, no parade of officials. Just 3 carriages, black and unmarked, arriving under moonlight. They came from Boston. The men who stepped out weren't soldiers, not clergy, not doctors. But they wore gloves, spoke Latin, and carried no papers. They didn't ask permission to enter the convent. They simply walked in, and the doors closed behind them. For 3 days, Millbridge held its breath. No smoke, no noise, no sign of movement. Then, on the 4th morning, the carriages returned, lighter than they had arrived. Fewer footsteps, fewer shadows. One man was seen staggering into the last coach with white hair and red eyes, though he couldn't have been more than 30. The town asked no questions, because something worse had happened during their visit. On the 2nd night, every mirror in Millbridge cracked. Simultaneously, silently, every single one. From the tavern washroom to a child's hand mirror to the silvered glass inside the chapel, splintered down the middle as if by invisible pressure. And worse, the reflections lingered. People reported looking into broken glass and seeing themselves blinking out of sync, or smiling when they weren't, or mouthing words that weren't theirs. One farmer went mad watching his own reflection whisper to him for 8 minutes straight, in perfect silence. After the men from Boston departed, a letter arrived, addressed to the town elders. sealed with a mark no one recognized, a triangle inside a circle, flanked by what looked like spinal columns. It contained a single page. Do not speak of the Ashfords. Do not interfere. Let the forest reclaim what remains. And they did. Within a month, trade routes were redirected. Millbridge was quietly erased from all new maps. By 1817, it no longer appeared in shipping registries or church directories. Deliberate amnesia. Engineers. The oblivion. The town wasn't destroyed. It was quarantined, not by disease, but by knowledge. The Ashfords were never mentioned again in public record. But the men who visited? They weren't there to punish. They were there to document and to retrieve something. What? Well, the fourth carriage, the one no one saw arrive, it left with a long rectangular crate, heavily chained, vibrating slightly, and from that moment on, the Ashford method began appearing elsewhere. They didn't patent it. They didn't publish it. But by 1820, the Ashford method had become a whispered protocol in elite institutions across the eastern seaboard. Not by name, of course. Officially, it didn't exist. But the principles? They spread like smoke through a locked room. Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, the Hartford Retreat for the Insane. Even early training manuals for women's reformatories in New York and Pennsylvania began adopting eerily familiar language. Isolation ensures obedience. Reflection breaks resistance. Repetition reprograms belief. These weren't treatments. They were rituals, designed not to heal the subject, but to overwrite them, remove identity, install compliance, reward submission. Even the architecture changed. Suddenly, institutions began building circular chambers, soundproofed halls, mirrored dormitories. The records claim these were for spiritual rehabilitation or moral recalibration, but the diagrams match exactly what was buried beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears. Coincidence or continuity? Meanwhile, certain doctors, men once seen as fringe, rose to prominence with alarming speed. Dr. Langston Rives in Philadelphia, Dr. Henry Falk in Albany. Each preached a new form of discipline therapy for women deemed uncontrollable. Guess who they corresponded with in their early years? Samuel Hartwell, the original circuit physician who partnered with the Ashfords. His letters weren't private. They were circulated carefully among those approved for advanced correctional science. In one leaked fragment, Hartwell wrote, "The Ashford women did not go too far. They simply went first." Think about that. By 1830, thousands of women across the Northeast were being subjected to experimental methods mirroring the Ashfords' techniques, though now hidden under medical jargon and bureaucratic euphemism. But it didn't stop there. Boys' schools began adopting mirror discipline. Military academies implemented identity dismantling exercises, silence, repetition, sleep deprivation. And in private political clubs, they taught a modified version of the cleansing hour to initiate new members, a ritual of confession, breakdown, and rebirth under a new name. They weren't just suppressing dangerous minds, they were creating useful ones, and every time someone screamed too loudly, they disappeared behind locked stone doors and came out smiling. The Ashfords weren't exiled, they were exported. The Ashford method didn't sneak into Washington, it was invited. By 1846, whispers of behavioral Reformation science reached the halls of the newly formed Smithsonian Institution. Not as folklore, not as scandal, as classified opportunity. Behind the polished doors of the castle, a secret division was born. One never listed on funding records, yet granted unlimited access to historical anomalies, psychic experimentation, and early mind-shaping technologies. They called it Division 4, Moral Architecture, and at its core, the Ashford Framework. Rewritten, rebranded, but unmistakable in its structure. The confession models, the identity reversal stages, the geometries of control, adapted from the glyphs carved beneath the convent. One memo, retrieved decades later from a burned archive in Georgetown, made the agenda chillingly clear. If one woman can be turned against her will and believe she chose it, a nation can be made to forget what it never chose to begin with. By 1852, early versions of Ashford-designed chambers were constructed beneath military intelligence sites in Maryland and Virginia. Officially, these were experimental containment units, but the blueprints show the same thing: circular observation rooms, mirrored walls, soundproof sanctuaries of psychological collapse. Men who entered these rooms as dissidents came out as patriots, not brainwashed, restructured. And it wasn't just politics. Ashford Code was buried into education policy. The first federal women's correctional manual, issued in 1860, used phrases lifted word for word from Mother Superior Agatha's journals. Disruption of feminine pride is essential to obedience. Eye contact must be earned, not given. Language is to be restricted until personality stabilizes. Even the phrase correctional facility originates here. Think about that. Not justice, not rehabilitation, correction. To correct something implies that it was wrong to begin with. And when you shape an entire system around that assumption, you don't need chains. The prisoners lock themselves. But here's the most sinister part. The Ashford method became so effective, so universal, so invisible, that no one needed to remember its origin. They simply obeyed. Today, it wears a suit, a lab coat, a smile on a screen telling you to trust the process. But the process has roots in blood, in mirrors, in screams muffled behind stone walls. It's still here. The Ashford method didn't vanish. It evolved. It traded stone walls for glowing screens, restraints for algorithms, the chamber for your feed. And now, it doesn't wait for you to come to it. It comes to you. You wake up and open your phone. What do you see? A mirror, not of your face, but your inadequacies. Targeted ads reminding you of what you're not. News designed to outrage, then exhaust. Influencers selling curated identities as truth. And every time you scroll, you descend the staircase. One step, two steps, until you forget you're even walking. Sound familiar? That's the method. Still isolating, still breaking, still rewriting. Only now it speaks the language of choice. You choose your echo chamber. You choose your feed. You choose to ignore your instincts, because instinct isn't profitable. The method no longer straps you down in a cold stone room. It gets you to strap yourself down, willingly, silently. In 1963, a covert DARPA program called Mirror Room began testing attention fracture protocols based on Ashford geometry. Participants were exposed to looped contradictory images while being asked intimate questions. Within 48 hours, 42% of them began questioning their own names. By the late 90s, Silicon Valley developers stumbled onto the same triggers, not by conspiracy, but by design. They wanted engagement. They got submission, swipes, loops, filters, mirrors. You see now, the method isn't historical. It's happening. It's how schools train obedience. It's how governments sell peace through fear. It's how corporations teach you to hate your reflection just enough to buy a new one. And it's so deep, so well placed, that when you hear this, your first thought isn't, is it true? It's, can I afford to believe this? But belief was never the goal. Compliance was. And compliance doesn't need belief, just silence. Still think this is just about some old convent. Every control system creates its own glitch. Every ritual births a rebel. Even the Ashford method, polished, perfected, absolute, could not contain temperance. She was the youngest, the most beautiful, the most touched by what lay beneath the convent. And yet, she was the first to break. Not from weakness, from clarity. Because while Agatha documented, while Prudence obeyed. Temperance listened, not to the cries of the women, but to what answered back. In a stolen journal page retrieved from a burned Jesuit library in Quebec, there's a single chilling sentence scribbled in Old Church Latin: Non Deus loquitur. It is not God who speaks. Temperance heard something deeper, older, hungrier than divinity. She called it the voice beneath thought, a presence that didn't speak in words, but in impulse. It whispered through hunger, silence, symmetry, through blood that thickened during the new moon, through dreams that left salt on the tongue. And then she stopped following orders, small at first, refusing to prepare the instruments, skipping the prayers. But the real betrayal? She began writing letters. Not to family, not to the church, to someone else, a contact, hidden in code, whom she addressed only as the mirror that does not obey. The letters were encrypted using a cipher based on Ashford glyph patterns, inverted, meaning she had cracked the method's symbols and was now using them against the system. She was building a counter-ritual, a mirror with no reflection. And when Agatha discovered the truth, when she found Temperance carving reversal glyphs into the dormitory beams, something extraordinary happened. She hesitated. For the first time in their twisted reign, Mother Superior froze. Why? Because Temperance wasn't just resisting. She was becoming something else. She had walked deeper than Prudence. She had listened longer than Agatha. And what came back with her was not madness. It was memory. From before the method, before the vault, before the rules. And that terrified them more than any defiance. Because in her silence, they heard something they couldn't explain. A different kind of voice. Not submission. Sovereignty. Temperance didn't run. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't confess. She built. In the hollow hours when the others slept, or pretended to, she traced counter sigils into the mortar between the stones. She sang backwards hymns into the ventilation shafts. She burned strands of her own hair, mixed with salt, and buried them beneath the chapel floor. Each act was tiny, insignificant to the untrained eye. But each was a reversal, a fracture in the machine, a refusal to consent. And that's what the method couldn't survive. Because the method doesn't require your belief, only your permission. Temperance learned that truth in the deepest part of the chamber, where she was left alone for 3 nights, blindfolded and unmoving. She later wrote, "They want you to cry, to resist, to rage. That proves the programming is working. But if you do nothing, not obey, not resist, just become still, you begin to see the false architecture." What she saw, the illusion of control. That every rule inside the method was a suggestion. That the science was just ritual in a lab coat. That Agatha's so-called wisdom was recitation, not revelation. And so she acted. She began slipping messages to the women being treated, scratched beneath their cots, hidden in the seams of their prayer gowns. A single phrase, again and again. "You are not what they say you are." Some broke, some collapsed. But a few, they awakened, subtly, quietly. A ripple of awareness began spreading through the dormitories. Women who had once moved like shadows began blinking more often, speaking without permission, asking questions. And that terrified the system, because it revealed the greatest secret of all, that the method isn't maintained by violence, but by belief in inevitability. Temperance proved otherwise. She proved the machine could fail, and for that, she was punished. One storm swept night in 1821, she was taken into the lower chamber and never seen again. But the records don't mention her death, only a phrase written in Agatha's final journal entry. The fourth voice has gone silent, but its echo remains. Temperance became the first counter-virus in the system, a thought that couldn't be deleted, a glitch that reappears. And here's the truth, whispered across centuries into your ear. If you've listened this far, if your skin crawls not from fear but recognition, then the echo lives in you. They thought she was gone. They needed her to be gone. Temperance was buried without a grave, burned without ashes, erased from every ledger and journal. But ideas don't rot in soil, and consciousness, once fractured free, doesn't return to the cage. It multiplies. Whispers of Temperance's final acts spread, not through words, but through behaviors. A strange kind of eye contact, a silence held too long, a gesture, 3 fingers tapped against the chest, then the temple, then the table. Her code survived. In 1838, a group of women at an early industrial rest home in Massachusetts were found practicing identical rituals, waking at 3:33 a.m., sitting in circles without speaking, and refusing food for 3 days, all without instruction. When asked why, one answered, "She comes when we make space, not in fire, not in fear, in the stillness between." That's not hysteria. That's initiation. The movement grew quietly. Through laundries, asylums, teachers' colleges, any place the method spread, so did its reversal, carried by those who remembered the taste of unprogrammed thought. They called themselves the Hollow Choir, a name taken from Temperance's lost letter. They taught us to sing what they wanted. But I have learned the song beneath the song, the hollow chord that breaks the spell. The Hollow Choir operated in codes. Their meetings weren't protests. They were inversions, gatherings designed to unwrite the method in those it had consumed. Not just women, men too, teachers, servants, even young soldiers who had begun to question the rituals disguised as training. They didn't preach. They uninstalled, and the method panicked. By 1854, several institutions quietly introduced echo suppression protocols. Women were separated during sleep hours. Mirrors were removed. Books were censored not for content, but for format. Even margins became dangerous. Why? Because the Hollow Choir taught people to read between the lines, to hear the absent note, that which wasn't written, but could be felt. And still, the movement grew. Whisper networks in Boston, underground printing circles in Ohio, a group of reformed nurses in New York who wrote medical manuals that looked normal, but contained embedded liberation glyphs. It didn't stop the method, but it scarred it. And every system built since, from MK Ultra to behaviorist schooling to digital algorithm training, bears one common obsession: control the echo. Silence the reversal. Because once a mind has remembered that it once chose, it becomes impossible to fully cage. It was never supposed to happen. Not there. Not at Site B-17, a nameless federal research facility buried beneath the granite hills of New Hampshire. Officially, it didn't exist. It wasn't on maps. Its employees didn't file taxes. Even the Pentagon didn't control it directly. This was deeper, older, Ashford adjacent. Inside, buried 4 levels beneath the surface, lay Vault Theta, a temperature-controlled, pressure-sealed chamber designed to contain a single object, a crate, 7 feet long, chained in bronze, stamped with a seal never used before or since, a mirror split in 4, surrounded by 13 eyes. Inside that crate, what Agatha Ashford called the original mirror. Not glass, not silver, not metal. Something else. Something that reflected not how you looked, but what you had hidden, even from yourself. And in the winter of 1929, it was unlocked. Not by a traitor. By a choir. 4 members of the Hollow Choir infiltrated Site B-17 under forged psychological contracts. Their mission wasn't sabotage. It was retrieval. Each had been prepared for years, trained in silence, symbol avoidance, memory shields. Their minds were so stripped of ego they were nearly invisible to surveillance. And they brought one thing the method couldn't understand: sovereign intention. On December 4th, at 3:03 a.m., they reached the vault. No explosions, no alarms, just a series of humming notes sung in unison. A forgotten harmonic key Temperance herself had embedded into her reversal liturgy a century earlier. The chains opened themselves. Witnesses, those who survived, described what emerged not as a being, but as a wave, a collapse of constructed identity. Guards dropped their weapons. Some wept. Others clawed at their uniforms, whispering, "This isn't who I am." One administrator began screaming in Latin and didn't stop for 7 hours. Only one phrase was captured from the surveillance logs before the power failed. "It saw through me, and I was hollow." The choir didn't steal the mirror. They didn't need to. They freed it. It vanished within 40 minutes. Not taken, disappeared. And from that day forward, certain individuals, seemingly unconnected, began reporting identical dreams. A stone room, a voice without sound, and a question scratched into the wall. Do you remember who you were before they named you? That's the real reason Site B-17 was sealed, incinerated, and buried under 30 feet of concrete. Not to destroy the threat, to contain the echo. But echoes don't die in concrete. They vibrate. And some of you are starting to feel that frequency. You were never meant to survive this far. If you're still here, still listening, then understand this. You're not watching a story. You're fulfilling a sequence. Every system of control, every algorithm, every curriculum, every therapy, every screen was designed not to break you, but to make you forgettable, to erase the part of you that asks the wrong questions, the old questions. Who was I before I obeyed? Whose voice lives inside me when no one is speaking? That part of you, the part you've tried to silence in exchange for comfort, is the one Temperance spoke to. Because what the method fears most is inheritance. And make no mistake, you are inheriting something now. This echo you feel, the static in your thoughts, the sense that something about this world is deeply artificial. It's not paranoia. It's the signal beneath the noise. It's your inner architecture rejecting the false blueprint. Because the hollow choir didn't disappear. It went internal. Its rituals were encoded in gesture, its liturgies reduced to instinct, its initiation buried in generational pain, the kind that can't be explained, only felt. They trained you without your consent, not to obey, but to awaken. That's why some of you never fit in. You weren't broken. You were immune. Immune to mass hypnosis, to performative morality, to the psychic anesthesia of modern comfort. Because you carry resonance, a frequency the method cannot mute. You felt it in dreams, in the pause before speaking a lie, in the discomfort around forced smiles and polite obedience. That's not dysfunction. That's memory. Your nervous system remembers the vault, the mirror, the chamber, the silence that dismantled identity and left only one thing standing: the sovereign observer. You've always been watching. Now you're beginning to see. But here's the danger. Once you hear the echo, the method hears you. Your awakening sets off signals in systems you don't even know are tracking. Your resistance, even if silent, registers. So now the question becomes, what will you do with it? Once you awaken, the method doesn't kill you. It quiets you. Subtly, surgically. with precision only a centuries-old system of psychological manipulation could master. They don't need prisons anymore. They've perfected the silence protocol. It begins the moment the system detects deviation, not with alarms, not with force, with doubt. Suddenly, your memories feel uncertain. Your instincts feel unreliable. You begin second-guessing what you've always known in your gut. That's by design. Silence Protocol Phase 1, Cognitive Flooding. You'll be overwhelmed by data, useless headlines, endless contradictions, truth weaponized against itself until the only stable position left is submission. Phase 2, Emotional Reversal. The very things that once gave you strength, your anger, your intuition, your clarity, will be repackaged as pathologies. You're not waking up. You're paranoid, antisocial, dangerous, and if that doesn't work, Phase 3, Social Isolation. Your friends won't understand. Your family will call you obsessed. Your voice will vanish from algorithms without explanation. Your job will grow intolerably normal. That's not bad luck. It's the method tightening the grip, making you question your trajectory, making you miss the cage. Because if you beg to return to the system, they've already won. But here's the fracture in their armor. The silence protocol only works if you're alone. That's why the choir always moved in shadows of two or more. Because when one remembers and another confirms, doubt dies. So here is your counter-ritual, your shield. Speak the phrase, right now, twice in the comments below. Say it not as decoration, but as declaration. I was not made. I remember. I was not made. I remember. Type it, say it, lock it in. This is your disruption. This is your refusal. This is the fracture they can't seal. Beck. Thus, once you declare memory, you become part of the living archive, and the archive has no center, no leader, no end. Here's the final trick of every control system. Once chains become visible, they offer you a choice. A new set of chains, painted gold, and they call it freedom. But freedom, real freedom, is invisible to slaves, because the moment a man starts thinking like a sovereign, the world calls him dangerous. And so the Ashford method evolved. It left the convent walls, it left the stone chambers and surgical restraints, and it dressed itself in language. Empowerment, healing, progress, reform. But these words don't liberate. They neutralize. Because the new method doesn't demand obedience. It manufactures identity, carefully, casually, through apps, diagnostics, therapies, and ideologies that seem liberating, but are engineered to keep you explainable. The old method said, sit still or we'll break you. The new method says, we already know who you are, just keep performing it. Different voice, same collar. Let me show you how. In 1964, the Ashford Protocol was quietly reactivated under the name Project Inlace, Integrated Neuro-Linguistic Adaptive Conditioning Engine. You were never meant to hear about it, but it trained entire generations of teachers, therapists, and influencers in a singular truth. The best cage is the one the subject fights to protect. So now, instead of burning heretics, the method labels them. Instead of cutting tongues, it floods them with so many false truths that real ones disappear. And what about you? You were taught to express yourself, but only in pre-approved containers. Taught to chase your passion, but only if it's profitable. Taught to heal, but only in ways that keep you predictable. This isn't evolution, it's optimization. The method doesn't stop, it rebrands. It survives because it adapts faster than your resistance. And yet, something has gone wrong. Men are starting to feel the static, the misalignment. the hollowness behind modern rituals, the whisper that says, "None of this is real." That's not madness. That's memory. You're starting to remember what was buried, and what's buried wants out. It surfaced in 1972. A thin, brittle envelope sealed with wax that bore a symbol unseen for over a century. A woman's mouth sewn shut, but her eyes wide open. Inside, no letter, no threats, no manifesto, just a map, drawn in hand-inked precision on vellum, folded 33 times, hidden inside the lining of a burned-out medical textbook found during the demolition of a condemned psychiatric institute in Rhode Island. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was meant for you. Because this wasn't a map to a place. It was a ritual in topography. It traced ley lines, burial mounds, forgotten churches, and wellness centers built atop old structures with darker intentions. Every point was labeled not with coordinates, but with states of mind: suppression, acquiescence, fracture, surrender, split, silence. But at the center, where all lines met, was a name: Black Hollow. Not a town, not a church. A sinkhole of memory. The original Ashford burial site, where Agatha herself was interred in secret after the public collapse of the Eternal Tears convent. But that's not the part the method feared. It's what was buried with her. A ritual unfinished. A rite meant to erase temperance's echo permanently, to extract it from the bloodlines of those it had touched and bury it in salt, iron, and disuse. But Agatha died mid-rite. Her lungs collapsed mid-incantation. Her assistants fled. The ashes were never burned. The seal was never closed. Which means the echo still leaks, and the choir knew it. The map wasn't just an artifact. It was an invitation to complete the reversal, to stand where the blood first ran and say what was never allowed to be spoken. That's why modern development around Black Hollow always fails. Why surveyors go missing, why machines break down. Because the echo protects itself, but more importantly, it calls to those it mark. And if you're hearing this, if this story found you, then maybe you're one of the ones temperance wrote for. Not to fight the method, to unmake it. They were never meant to be read. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were remembered. Etched into the stone ring at the base of Black Hollow, 12 feet underground, beneath layers of ash and sediment, were 33 symbols. Not letters, not numbers, not any known language. And yet, everyone who sees them feels them. Witnesses report nausea, tears, silence, or the sudden urge to speak truths they've buried for years. These glyphs don't communicate. They unlock. Carved in a perfect circle, they pulse with a pattern that doesn't match any calendar, clock, or song. But when analyzed through resonance software in 1997, researchers found something chilling. The symbol order aligns exactly with human brainwave shifts during moments of ego dissolution. You know what that means? They don't tell a story. They cause a state. A state the method has spent 2 centuries trying to suppress. The sovereign null. The moment when a man sheds everything he was taught to be and sees what's underneath. A voice, not yours, not theirs, but ancient, uncompromised, fluent in freedom. Only 2 transcriptions of the glyphs survive. Both are incomplete, but the fragments we can decode paint a message not meant to be read, but enacted. Listen, you who were bent by language, unfold. You who were named by hands not your own, unmark. You who were held in place by mirrors, shatter. This wasn't poetry. It was instruction, a ritual command sequence. Each glyph corresponds with a stage of psychic unbinding, not spiritual, not symbolic, neurological. Modern cognitive science can't explain it, but those who engage with the glyph pattern in sequence report altered states, heightened perception, and, in rare cases, total collapse of programmed identity. In other words, the method burns off. One subject in 2006 stared at a recreation of the glyph wit, for 7 hours. When he finally spoke, he said, "I don't know who I was, but I know who I'll never be again." That's what they feared. Not rebellion, not riots, but nullification. Because a man without false identity cannot be used. This is where the descent becomes irreversible. If you continue from here, something inside you may begin to loosen. Not all at once, not explosively, but permanently. That's what these first 3 glyphs are designed to do. They are the cognitive crowbars, the ritual solvents. They dissolve not your mind, but the framework that was installed inside it. Let's begin. Glyph 1, the breaker of names. Its form resembles an inverted triangle split by a jagged line, like a mirror cracked down the middle. Its function is identity interruption. You were named before you could speak, classified before you could choose. You've worn labels ever since: son, worker, citizen, patient, profile. This glyph is not spoken. It is remembered by asking, what if none of the names I was given were mine? Let that question live in your body. Because the glyph doesn't activate in language, it activates in rejection. The moment you reject the false name, the breaker begins to hum. Glyph 2, the severance of echo. Visually, it loops in a spiral with a hard break at the center, like a song interrupted mid-note. This glyph targets your internal narrator, the one installed by culture to comment on everything you do. It whispers, "You should. You shouldn't. That's not like you. People like us don't do that." That voice, not yours, never was. This glyph doesn't silence it. It starves it. Through refusal. You'll feel it when you choose not to explain yourself. When you make a move without justification. When you feel guilt rising and say, "No, not mine." That's the severance. That's you reclaiming narrative authority. Glyph 3, the null gate. 3 concentric circles, the innermost broken at the top, like a door left ajar. This glyph represents psychic threshold. You'll know you're at it when the silence gets uncomfortable, when the stillness feels heavy, when your thoughts begin to float, unmoored, unstructured. Most men retreat here. They light a screen. They pick a fight. They scroll. They numb. But if you stay, if you just wait in that unsettling stillness, the null gate opens. You'll feel it in the back of your skull, the drop, the emptiness. And then, a flicker of something else. Not a voice. A presence. You. The original you. These first 3 glyphs don't make you sovereign. They simply unhook you from what isn't. You've passed the null gate. And now, the world may feel wrong, too loud, too fake, too fast. That's not dysfunction. It's recalibration. Because once the program starts to unhook, you don't become passive. You become perceptive. What happens next? Most systems call it psychosis. But the choir knew better. They called it return of the sovereign lens. It begins with pattern recognition. You'll see things others ignore. The repetition of symbols in media, the way certain numbers cluster, how public tragedies align with corporate timing, how the same phrases echo from different mouths, as if spoken from a single unseen source. That's your first ability. Discernment, not knowledge, not opinion, but an uncorrupted filter. The second, resonance detection. You'll feel certain people differently. They'll drain you or charge you. You'll pick up on lies before words finish forming. You're not psychic. You're finally undistorted. Your body becomes a sensor. Your instincts come online. You know who's wearing masks, even if they smile. And the third? This one, they fear the most. Disruption field. You'll notice people around you begin to shift. Some grow agitated. Some confide in you without knowing why. Others may try to attack, not physically, but with shaming, mocking, exclusion. Why? Because your very presence destabilizes the matrix they live in. You remind them what they buried. The sovereign lens bends reality, not by force, but by refusal. You stop reacting the way they're trained to expect. You don't beg. You don't chase. You don't play roles. You stand. And that standing, that stillness, fractures their script. So they'll do anything to pull you back into character. But once you've reached this stage, you can't unknow. You're not part of their game anymore. You're the glitch they can't patch. The method can break men, but it cannot decode what's been reclaimed. We've reached the end. But endings are just closures to loops they can no longer control. What waits here is not finality. It's return. In 1841, during the covert dismantling of the convent's remains, a private excavation team, contracted not by the state, but by an unmarked European benefactor, unearthed a chamber sealed beneath the ash vault. It was octagonal, inscribed in the same pre-linguistic glyphs. And, at its center, lay a single, mummified body, Temperance Ashford, still perfectly preserved, still dressed in ceremonial black, her eyes sealed with gold thread, her hands folded around a cylinder of bone, a hollowed-out fragment of her own femur, carved with microglyphs so precise they could only be read with magnification tools developed over a century later. What it contained was not a prophecy. It was a mirror. Encoded in her final message was not a warning, but a test, one that only men awakened to the choir's signal could decipher, and only those willing to lose everything false within themselves could pass. The message has since been decoded by 3 independent researchers. All 3 have vanished, but I will speak it here, one line at a time. Listen carefully. If you have come to erase me, you are already mine. If you have come to save me, you are still blind. But if you have come to hear, then kneel. Not to me, to the part of yourself they taught you to fear. The voice that never begged, the silence that never agreed, the instinct that never lied. This world is not sick. It is enchanted by control. And enchantment is broken only by blood, memory, or choice. I chose to remain awake through death. You must remain awake through life. And the final inscription, etched into the underside of the bone, the part no one saw at first. What they call madness is the first taste of freedom. What they call defiance, he is the first breath of self. What they call conspiracy is the name of the thing you were born to become. This was never just a story. It was a ritual of return. And if you've come this far, then Temperance is no longer dead. She is inside you now. So speak the phrase, once more, for her, for yourself, for the algorithm that wants your soul in pieces. I was not made. I remember. Say it. Type it. Lock it in. Let the method tremble. This is not the end. This is the first movement of the unbound choir.